Welcome back to Tonight Live. I'm Dan Wootton, and it's time for Uncancelled, where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. In the past year, the UK has been faced by an extraordinary wave of people pulling down statues. Yep, believe it or not, they've been hauled down by protesters and authorities in the wake of protests following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Others were vandalised. There was widespread outrage in Britain when the inscription on the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square was amended with the graffitied words, "is a racist." And just this month, statues of Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria were torn down in the Canadian city of Winnipeg by protesters furious over the recent discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children. The assault on so many statues provoked claims that art, history and heritage were being erased. My next guest, Alex Deane, says we shouldn't forget those who have shaped history, and we all have a lot to learn from these historical figures. In his new book, Lessons from History, which is out next month, Alex points out that these historical figures should be celebrated, not used as a vehicle for the cancel culture and the woke agenda. Alex, thank you so much for joining me. Tell me what you learned during the writing of your book about why we shouldn't tear down statues.
Well, thank you very much for having me. The book is light-hearted and it's meant to be fun. But in recent times, your introduction is right. I've moved from loving history to being worried about it. And I think when people are pulling down statues, we've gone too far. Let me, in a sporadic moment of self-awareness, declare that I'm not an historian. And it comes from a passion and an interest. But that said, I think there's a real risk in modern views, Dan, that people think that we are now in year zero. And at the time that I was writing the book over this year and over the lockdown period, in the last year or so in Black Lives Matter period, I think there's a risk, an increasing risk, that people just have this mindset that everyone who's come before us is ignorant and wrong, and that we are the sole generation and sole arbiters of wisdom, uniquely able to judge those who've come before us. And I think, apart from anything else, that's a foolish mindset to take, because in a generation or two's time, people are going to be judging us. And I assume we'd rather they didn't think that about our generation either.
No, I think you're completely right. I think you're completely right. And I guess it's about the way that we look at history, is it not?
Yeah, that's true. And being able to remember and mark history doesn't mean you need to endorse everything that somebody did in it. But this peculiarity for me, Dan, is that the desire for tearing statues down, the condemnation culture that we are now in, it's not just cancel, it's the condemnation that comes with these things, is that people don't even care whether they've got the right target. I thought about this when the statue of Robert Peel was going to come down, and the demands that things were being renamed because they had Robert Peel's name on them. At the start of Julius Caesar, the mob captures a man called Cinna because they think he's Cinna the conspirator. And it turns out he's Cinna the poet. And the mob says, so what? Tear him for his bad verses. Well, when it turned out that the people who were concerned about Robert Peel were accusing him of an interest in slavery because that's what Robert Peel's father had done, they said, so what? Doesn't matter. Take down the statue anyway. I mean, truly, we're in the realms of the sins of the father here. So, I would say, Dan, what starts with statues doesn't end with statues. And in fact, what starts with statues isn't really about statues at all. It's about a culture war in which people don't believe anymore in analysis or interpretation or real thought. It's a division between destroyers and preservers. And in that divide, I'm absolutely on the side of the preservers.
Indeed. Now, what's so interesting about your book, Alex, and this became a bit like a hobby for you during lockdown, is actually you've chosen to focus on the overlooked, the most obscure historic events. So it's not necessarily history that people will be familiar with.
I guarantee there'll be stories that people haven't heard. So one of my favourites is of a guy called Leonid Rogotsov, and it's not all, rah-rah British either, although there is a good fair bit of that, and I'm sure I'll be accused of being a gammon for that, which will not be a first. Leonid Rogotsov, Soviet doctor, was the doctor on the 6th Soviet Antarctic expedition, who in the blizzard of an Antarctic winter fell sick and had to take out his own appendix. sort of master and commander style, props up a mirror and looks at it. It's a story I'd never heard until I started working on the book, and my brother-in-law-to-be told me about this story, quite famous in medical community, but not for the rest of us. The reason I love that story so much, Dan, is that we live in a culture where people like feeling sorry for themselves. And I think to myself, when you think you've had a bad day, think about a guy who's in the middle of an Antarctic winter and looks down at his tummy and thinks, I've got to cut myself open if I'm going to survive the winter.
No, you're right. Next time I'm moaning about missing the train or getting wet, I am going to remember that. The one that I've been desperate for you to explain to me, the Pork and Bean War. What was that? I'd never heard of that.
Yeah, I actually don't think you should disappear down Pork and Beans Wars. My favourite war of that environment is there's a couple of bear wars. The Pork and Beans Wars are, I love Canadian and colonial history, but I think the best bit of those things out of Aroostook is when we looked at having a war over what was and became Maine. A big chunk of it was British territory. And the point about that is that we started off saying, Area X was ours, and the Americans said Area Y was theirs, including a large part of ours. We had a map that basically endorsed their claim. They had a map that basically endorsed our claim. Both maps didn't really come to light in the course of the dispute. We asked others to arbitrate. They said in the end, oh, forget it. We'll draw a line down the middle and say that'll be the border. And instead of going with it, the Americans kicked off conflict with us. Well, at the end of that conflict, they wind up with about 4/5 of what they'd started for. Lesson being, sometimes, even if you think you're being hard done by, just take the deal.
Yes, very good. Listen, look, I've got my panel with me. Alex Deane, Carol Malone, Benjamin Butterworth and Neil Oliver. Neil, as a fellow historian, archaeologist, anything you want to ask Alex?
Well, I was so enjoying listening to Alex describing himself not as a historian but as a lover of history, which is really the position I come from as well. I'm an archaeologist, I've stumbled into matters historical, and to me, history is a narrative. Really, it's a story that successive generations tell themselves and each other about what they think happened in the past, and you never get an absolute perfect version of the past. By definition, different generations tell it differently, and which is why I think Alex is absolutely right about the insanity around the pulling down of statues. To me, it seemed to be symptomatic of a kind of it's a madness. It's in there with burning effigies like Guy Fawkes. It's in there with when Charles II came back to the throne, he had Cromwell's body exhumed along with some others so that they could be hung. So that they could execute them. There's a madness that when you look back on it, you think, goodness me, we would never behave in that way now. But then, of course, you get the stuff around the statuary. I think if I was going to ask Alex anything, I would say, are you optimistic or not based on your fresh eye that you have cast over the statue story amongst others? Do you think it's a madness we'll get beyond, or do you think?
No, I do. I actually am optimistic. I think that there's a great number of people. They may be what's once called the silent majority, but I think there's a great many people in this country and elsewhere, Neil, who are appalled by this concerted attempt to trash our history and aim at some glorious year zero. And the attempts to realise that by guilt trips and assertions of group guilt, which we, broadly speaking, shouldn't feel. And then if those things fail, then violence. I think that, and which is what it is when you go and tear something down, not through some democratic process, but because you've got the mob with you to do it. I think that there has been widespread feelings of revulsion at that kind of behaviour. And that's what I take comfort in, not the behaviour, but the widespread dislike of what's being done. Now, it may be that some people are afraid to speak out and afraid to express their dislike of what's being done, supposedly in their name, if it's the mob says that they act on our behalf. But I think the current environment is one in which any element of not just demurring from that positive enthusiasm for destruction, but even silence. Even silence is condemned as being as racism, or a sign of being complicit in whatever it is that you're criticising. I think people see through that, and I think that no matter how shrill and hectoring the demands are for the destruction of our past, the majority of people think it's wrong. And the more extreme those demands get, the more people actually think anymore, I can't be on the sidelines. I have to say, I think this is bad.
Deane, fascinating stuff. The book Lessons from History is out next month. That's tonight's Uncancelled. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.